All right, everyone, I think we are ready to start our next session. If you would be so kind as to find your seats, we'll do a brief introduction with our panelists for another engaging session, and we will have the opportunity for some Q&A. So as you're listening to their insight and their expertise, if any questions come to mind, please make sure that you jot them down so that when we come to the Q&A portion of the program, we're ready to engage and make the most of our time together this afternoon. Gentlemen, I'll give a brief introduction, but I'll let you give more of a little background about who you work with, what you do, and your interest in being here today. We have Frank Hamrick here with us, the Regional Vice President at Clayton Homes with the Manufacturing Housing Institute of South Carolina. Dennis Cyphers, Executive Director for the Santee-Lynches Regional Council of Governments. Owen McBride with the South Carolina Association of Counties, and Scot Slatton. Is it Slatton or Slatton?
Slatton.
Slatton, got it, Scott. Thank you so much, Slatton, with the Municipal Association of South Carolina. Great to have all of you with us. Frank, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Yep. I'm Frank Hamrick, and I get the opportunity to work with Clayton Homes. We have 26 or 27 dealers here in South Carolina. On top of that, I get to work with the Manufactured Housing Institute, as well as the many independent dealers throughout the state. So not just South Carolina, but North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and our home building group out of Tennessee.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dennis.
Yes, my name's Dennis Cyphers, and as stated, I am the Executive Director for the Santee-Lynches Council of Governments. And so one of the important things for us being here is that we don't cover just one set of these panels, right? We cover a lot of things. We do offer programs in the housing sector, economic development. We work hand in hand with the SC Works and pretty much oversee the SC Works centers as well. Infrastructure, there's not a piece of infrastructure in the state that we don't touch. That might be water or sewer, that could be roadway. But the list goes on. So I'm excited to be here, and thank you, ma'am.
We appreciate it. Thank you so much. Owen.
Thank you, Judi. I'm Owen McBride with the South Carolina Association of Counties. I'm their Assistant Director of Government Affairs. I focus most of my issues on revenue and local revenue up at the State House, trying to get counties more authority to raise that local revenue, take some of the burden off the state. And I've been there for going on 12 years, working with the Association of Counties. So.
We appreciate it. And Scott.
Thank you, Judi. Good morning. I'm Scot Slatton with the Municipal Association of South Carolina. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Communication for the association, so I'm responsible for our lobbying shop and our communication shop. I am a former city manager here in South Carolina, town manager in North Carolina, both rural towns. I've been with the association in a number of capacities since 2008, and I'm more than happy to be here talking with you all today and discuss wonky stuff that Owen and I especially enjoy talking about every day when we're working on behalf of our members at the State House.
Well, we certainly appreciate your time and your expertise. Our focus for this discussion will be expanding opportunities and infrastructure in South Carolina's rural communities, which obviously is a huge issue that we have to tackle. And so our first question basically is a little bit of an overview, kind of broad, saying we've had tremendous growth in many areas of our state. We've also seen that many counties in South Carolina seem to be left behind. We are not seeing an announcement of new industry or new jobs, particularly in our rural areas. So Scott, we'll start with you and work our way back down the panel. What do you believe the biggest obstacles are in terms of building that growth in rural areas?
Yeah, great question, and I don't think that there can be any denial that our rural counties, our rural municipalities within those counties have been struggling where other parts of our state have been prospering and growing like wildfire. What are some of the reasons for that? Well, obviously, the dearth of infrastructure that is available to those communities to bring in economic development opportunities on a large scale, particularly the industrial scale. I think on a micro scale, we at the Municipal Association have been engaging in training our folks, our rural cities and towns on micro economic development, if you will, in terms of revitalizing their downtowns, and trying to attract smaller types of economic development opportunities rather than necessarily the white whale. But in those communities where the city or the town is the primary water and sewer provider, especially, those cities have to work very closely with their county counterparts and have to be a part of the equation whenever the Department of Commerce or the county's economic development folks are working. So the dearth of water and sewer infrastructure that's in the ground, and we'll talk more about, Judi, I know, and the rest of us, how the state has been addressing that and how we've been addressing it locally. But aside from water and sewer, of course, there's road infrastructure, and Owen and I have been doing work on road infrastructure with members of the General Assembly and others over the years. The availability of broadband internet service, of course, has been a hindrance to economic development. But again, the state has been putting monies toward that by way of the federal government and the funds that came down, especially through the American Rescue Plan, and we can get into more detail on that. So obviously the lack of infrastructure from top to bottom is a hindrance. Lack of interstate access obviously is in some communities a problem, but there are ways to overcome that obstacle in terms of interstate access that we can talk about more later. That's just from my point of view.
A great foundation there. Owen, what would you add in terms of, because obviously this is not a new problem for South Carolina, and there are investments being made, but what are the biggest challenges in us really making a big leap forward?
I think it all stems back to deferred maintenance. We've waited so long to get our roads back up to where they need to be, and you know it's always a system of the haves and the have-nots with counties. I've seen it since I started. You've got counties that can afford to bring in companies, can offer incentives, can have good school districts, can sell that to the companies to come in, and then you've got counties that don't have the tax base to perform the infrastructure, can't provide those arteries to the highways. I think DOT has done a great job with their Rural Safety Road Program. I think if you saw the number of accidents and fatalities on the farm to market roads in South Carolina, it would scare you to death, literally. Some of those roads are the worst roads in the state and in the country. And until we fix those and provide the infrastructure that businesses need to get their employees safely to and from work and provide education opportunities for their children, it's that the haves and the have-nots are going to continue to, that growth gap is going to continue to expand. So from a county perspective, that's what we've been working on. I know you've seen it over the years. Some smaller industries have started to utilize rural areas of the county, but I think a lot of that is based on the urban sprawl and everybody coming to South Carolina and pushing the boundaries of cities and towns outside into the unincorporated areas. So eventually it's going to happen. I think DOT is well aware of that. They are pumping quite a bit of money into those rural roads, those arteries, as I mentioned, to the highways, but also until you fix problems that are happening on our highways and the two-lane highway debacle on I-95, it's going to be tough for those rural counties like Jasper and Colleton to bring in businesses, because businesses and industries do not want their employees traveling on that road until it's safe. I mean, that's the bottom line. So I harp on what Scott said as far as infrastructure, and I go back to deferred maintenance. And the problem with that, when you're bringing a bunch of people into the state, they are relying on the current people in the state to pay for everything that they're going to need when they get here. So you've got to find a way to, and I'm sure we'll expand about funding opportunities, but putting it on the backs of the residents here in South Carolina is not sustainable. Not when you have millions of people moving to South Carolina, and we want this place to be a desirable state to live in. I think it is, but you've got to be prepared when they get here. Otherwise, it's just going to exacerbate the problem.
Thank you so much. Owen, Dennis, what would you add in terms of the biggest obstacles for improving opportunities in rural areas?
Yeah, so the first thing I'm going to say is this is the last time I sit on a panel with masks and SCAC staffers, because they eat up all the information and leave us just a little bit to work with. But I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to piggyback on some of the things that we just heard some statements on. As far as the transportation that we're referring to right here, I think that is one of our major concerns right now. We are focused on that, but not transportation just from roadway standing, but also from public transit as well, because we know that we have many manufacturers coming into the region, and the biggest concern they have is, how do I get staff here? When we start talking about our rural areas, that's another thing that pushes them away. They need to be closer to those urban hubs, if you will. So I think that's the responsibility of those urban hubs and those transit systems to help get them out there. As far as transportation, and we start talking about widening roads or adding lanes or things of that nature, I don't know how many people are aware of what it costs per mile to widen a road, but it used to be $10 million a mile. I got an estimate last week of $12 million a mile to work on some roads. So the idea of making these roads wider so we can allow more access and more traffic to flow, that's a long reach, right? Because you can't put enough dollars together in our rural areas to cover all these roadways to make it beneficial. So we've got to figure a way to reduce those traffic flows, get people where they need to go. And I think you're right, the deferred maintenance is one thing. We've got to start putting and be responsible for ourselves and put some skin in the game from the county and the municipality level to make sure these things take place. I think that if we can kind of plan ahead, we're not going to get to feel that in our generation, but maybe the upcoming generations will feel some of that investment we put in, that skin in the game that we put in, and we'll see some more growth in these rural areas. I think right now, my region especially, I know a lot of the rural areas, they have struggled, but we have really been able to unite a 4-county region. We do have some major economic centers, and I say major, but larger economic centers with Sumter. In our rural areas, we've done a good job of getting jobs in close to that urban area, but also being able to get the transportation resources necessary to get individuals from those more rural jurisdictions into those areas and then back home. So I think for us, that'll continue to be a focus, especially when we look at mass or public transit of some sort, because the roadway system is just too great a expense to fully develop it out.
Great insight. Frank, what would you add from the manufacturing housing aspect in terms of just the biggest obstacles in terms of moving more growth into rural areas?
Yeah, it is interesting to hear, you guys, as you look at it from really a government standpoint and me looking at it from a builder's standpoint. And I love the fact, we love that people are moving to South Carolina. I moved here in '96, and it took me a minute, but now it's like, man, South Carolina is the best place to live, And so I love all the people coming. Of course, we're building houses all across for that. But, when it comes to the rural areas, I would say, and my statistics may not be exact, but about 20% of it is manufactured housing. I mean, that's where we go. If there's infrastructure there, I don't get to go there, right? So it's interesting, though, over the past, I don't know, probably 3, 4, 5 years, I'm seeing we have more and more access to it. And it's tough. We're a one-off builder. I mean, I don't know how many one-off builders there are anymore. You have a piece of property, and I'll build a house on it. I'll come out and put a house there, and there's not a lot of that. And it gets difficult. I mean, how are you going to impact an attainability housing crisis when we're doing one-offs? So, Mungo Homes, they're part of Clayton Properties Group. We've learned a lot from them. And you watch what they do. And when you're talking about this housing sector that's missing, this price point, somebody said 100, maybe 150. I mean, my son bought his first house, and if you think about it, we all rented. Then we bought a house, got that first one. Then you had a family, and you're like, okay, well, I got to get something a little bigger, and then when you're my age, you're thinking, well, maybe it's time to get something smaller again, But our kids don't get that step. He bought his first house was $300,000. Now, I mean, that might not sound like a lot. To me, that's a lot.
Yeah, my oldest, he's 24, Frank. He's an electrical lineman. And I wish that he could find something to afford on his own, because he's back at home with us.
Yes.
After been having gone for a few years and changed career paths, and now he's back. And he brought the dog with him. That's
I got two dogs that way.
I think I like the dog almost as much as him. But you're right. I agree with you. it's a problem for people his age. I mean, he makes decent money as an electrical lineman, but what was in the state paper over the weekend, I think the average single person has to make $88,000 in South Carolina to be what they term comfortable. I don't know what
Right.
that means. My comfort level at 24 was a lot lower probably than his is. So I think, you know, from your perspective and your industry's perspective, specifically manufactured housing, and I've talked to Shel Suber about this before. Shel, I know you're out here. You know, one of the obstacles that you have traditionally faced is the sort of the stigma that's attached to manufactured housing.
Yes.
But your industry is so much different today than it was when I think of manufactured housing as a younger person. And so
Yeah.
I think part of that attitude change needs to come. I will admit in cities especially, because we generally, cities don't promote or appreciate manufactured housing to the extent that they should, but in attempting to address the affordability issue, I think more and more of our cities need to take a closer look and get over that stigma that has been attached to your industry for a while.
And if you don't mind, I do want to speak to that for a second, because you didn't come up with that stigma in a vacuum,
No, of course not, no.
right?
Yeah.
We contributed to it.
Yeah.
And over the years, we've owned that to go, you know, you ride by and, you know, you see a manufactured home and you can tell immediately because the foundation height or the steps or the siding's not there. You know, you have this perception, and of course, we know the perception is poor quality, it's not safe, you know, wind, all these things. And we would admit we didn't do the best job. We would also say, look, our industry has changed not just from the quality of the home, the safety of the home, but I would argue, you know, the professionalism of it. I was thinking about, you know, you talk about your son. My son works for me. And, you know, our warranty techs are going to come in and start at $25, $30 an hour, which wasn't the way it used to be. We're working with licensing now with LLR to go, hey, if you're going to be in the industry, there's a certain licensing you have to have. And so I do think that plays a factor in it. And the fact that we have manufactured homes as personal property, so that they're taxed as personal property, not real property. Yeah. Those are all issues that we have looked to work and address. So, yeah, I would invite anybody, if you hadn't been in a manufactured home, walk in one, at least talk to us. You know, now we're building e-built homes that, as far as, I mean, they're zero energy ready, built to the Department of Energy standards. So I appreciate you saying that, and I think you're exactly right. And I think as that changes, we may have opportunities, but and I will later want to address that manufactured home as real property and not personal property.
Well, we may come, my wife and I may come to you and talk about something smaller to motivate him to get out, right?
I've got 4, so yeah, we'll do it together.
We will definitely come back to that. Dennis, I want to come back to you, and I'm going to let you speak first this time, on the issue of transportation, because as you laid out the financial burden that comes with widening roads, okay, and just, you know, the fact that in a lot of ways that's not sustainable or feasible to do in looking at public transit in South Carolina. I mean, if you had a magic wand and could make those improvements and changes in South Carolina, what would that look like in terms of really being able to meet our needs and to address the challenges that we're having in rural communities?
Currently, I think we've got a few of our transit systems that do a really good job. When you look at CARTA down in the BCD area, the Charleston area, they do a really good job. I think Comet does a good job of getting people, all diverse groups of people, which is a big thing. I think there's such a stigma around the use of public transit in this area.
Well,
right?
we've had some, you're right about the stigma, and Comet has had some problems that they've worked to overcome, which I think they've made a lot of progress, but trying to overcome the stigma of what people have always viewed Comet as has been a problem, I think.
You're right, and I think that we need to look at it as people moving equipment. We need to look at it as economic development vehicles, because that's what we're trying to accomplish. You know, there's all these barriers that we deal with some of our federal funding, whether that's through Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act or any type of work center ideas or grant funding that we use. And transportation is the #1 barrier. So we're never going to advance unless we figure out that piece of the puzzle, that transportation piece. And that transportation piece means getting people to their workforce, to their workplace, getting them home from that workplace. So many times we see transit routes that cut off at a certain time in our smaller transit systems. So yeah, I can get to work at 7:30 or 8 o'clock, but I can't get home at 5 or 6 because the transit services are not making those loops. So I think there's some more frequency and some more vehicle miles that'll need to be traveled to make that work in these smaller, kind of what we would call metropolitan planning organizations in those transit systems. But I think that we need to look at that piece. It's a lot cheaper piece of the puzzle to look at than the roadway improvements. I think everybody up here is very aware of that cost. And, you know, the numbers I was given were based off, you know, arterial roads, not interstate roads. We start talking interstate, now we're talking $30 million a mile to upgrade. So public transit, no matter what it looks like, maybe that's on-demand service, maybe that's fixed route servicing. I think that's the things that will carry us to keep manufacturers happy and keep them in place and keep them expanding their footprint in our region. But we need to kind of fine tune the way we're operating right now.
Frank, as we look at opportunities for improvement, I mean, would you agree transportation is the big focus for your industry, or is there another area where you'd also like to see some investment?
Well, I do think it's interesting. In August, I got to meet with Senator John Scot, and he had envisioned a manufactured home manufacturing facility in one of the rural counties. And of course, he talked about infrastructure, and he talked about transportation. I think one of his dreams was a light rail system that could service maybe some of these areas. But, you know, and interestingly enough, when I bring that up to our home building group, their first thoughts are, of course, transportation's one, but infrastructure and then workforce housing. You know, is it there? So.
Yeah, that's a big issue. So, Owen, as we come back and we think about strategies, kind of just flipping the script a little bit. I mean, you guys have done a great job of laying out what some of those challenges are. If you could, you know, again, wave that magic wand and say, okay, let's make this a top priority and fix this today to have the biggest impact, what would that be?
Well, yes, mass transportation and the comet and everything in the urban areas is great, but eventually, if you're going to get the people that live out in the rural areas to work, there's going to have to be something else. And right now, the solution is pump a bunch of money into the road so they can get there themselves. I think Scott mentioned earlier broadband, and as more jobs become remote, you've got to be able to provide access to people outside of the city, and I think our state has actually done a very good job with that. They have they've taken advantage of federal grants. They've pumped state money in, but it doesn't matter if there are jobs available if the people cannot get to them. And so I think the mass transit within the city limits is doing a great job, but it's eventually, once we master that, so to say, you've got to be able to expand those opportunities to people in the rural areas, especially as more people are moving to the rural areas because the price of housing in the urban areas is getting so unattainable. So I think whether it's light rails, I'm not discounting that, but I've also heard numbers. You talk about expensive and somehow, like I said, I've been in politics for 11 years, and politics always gets in the way of a good idea. And so you're
Y'all can give that a big round of applause.
you're always going to have money pumped to certain areas of the state. That's just how it works. That's how it works now. That's how it's worked since I've started here. So unless you have a statewide approach to providing transportation from people in rural areas, or you finish the broadband so it allows people in those rural areas to have the capacity to work from home and reliable capacity, because you don't want people getting fired because they can't make work because their internet is not good.
Right.
I think it's a huge problem to tackle. I think South Carolina's stance on that is always chew a little bit off at a time instead of tackling some of the bigger issues all at once. But it's not, as more industries come to South Carolina and as more people move to the rural areas, it's gonna it's really going to expound on the problem. So.
Well, and you give me a great segue to Scott, because when you talk about, South Carolina chewing off a little bit at a time, you've done such an excellent job of laying out what a lot of the obstacles are and even the investments, right,
Yep.
toward making progress. But is the answer now just to wait until we, make all of these, broadband and all of that, or are there other gaps that we still need to address?
Well, I can think of an example right now, Judi, to that question. So if we talk about road infrastructure in the rural parts of the state, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the State Transportation Infrastructure Bank, the STIB, people call it. It is it's a large road project funding mechanism that runs through the state, runs through the Department of Transportation, but those funds have traditionally only been available to massive, large-scale transportation projects. It was created to build the Ravenel Bridge, right? That's why the STIB was created, and it's continued to exist ever since then. But one of the problems, particularly for rural areas, is the fact that the spending thresholds to get some of that money from the SIB are so high that a lot of rural areas just can't get there. They just don't have a project big enough, any single project big enough to garner SIB funds. So one of the things that we did in testifying in front of actually a committee a couple of years ago that Representative Cobb Hunter chaired was to make a couple of recommendations. First, lower the threshold, the spending threshold for SIB funds for rural areas in particular. From I think it's 50 million now is the minimum. 25 million.
So that would require legislative approval?
Yes.
Okay.
No, I don't think the SIB could do it on their own.
So
Okay.
that's an internal policy within the State Infrastructure Bank, and it's been a huge headache for rural counties because, as Scott said, a Jasper or Clarendon, I keep going back to them, but they've offered projects, they need projects, but they can't reach it on their own.
Can't on their own, any one project. However, to help cumulatively, well, first of all, lower the minimum, the maximum, the minimum spending threshold. That's one of the things that we recommended. And the other thing we recommended was allow these communities to bundle projects so that they could more easily get to that spending threshold, whatever it might be. So if it's, let's say it's 15 million instead of 25 million, no single project in Jasper County might make it to a $15 million threshold, but there are multiple projects that they could bundle together in one application. And currently, and I think the SIB's working more towards that kind of a concept, but I think that would help address some of these road infrastructure problems in some rural areas rather than the way we're doing it now.
Or even bundle projects with other counties.
Right, precisely.
That's been an issue. I'll also say along the road, and I don't want to hijack the conversation.
No,
I want to leave you all plenty of opportunity. But there's CTCs, and the amount of money that the state has sent back to CTCs is a huge blessing to
county transportation committees.
County transportation committees. Quite frankly, the DOT has a list of projects that probably will take 20, 30 years to get fixed, and they don't have they claim they don't have the resources to take care of the farm to market roads and the county roads. So sending that money back to counties has been a huge, they've done it in the budget the last couple of years. Depending on which budget you look at this year, there's another allocation of a couple $100 million going back to CTCs. And I think that's where we really need to focus on, because counties often can get that work done cheaper, quicker. And one kind of issue with that money is that there's a 25% requirement that money has to be spent on state roads. And when you're spending that much money back, the DOT, now $1 billion agency, is out there fixing the state roads. Why not allow the counties and to utilize 100% of that money for roads in their neighborhoods? And that's really been our press this year, is to try to work on that requirement and lessen that requirement, because the state system's closed. So anytime new development comes, the roads that lead up to that are going into the county system. So those are the ones that are gonna, and with all the infrastructure needs and the water and sewer expansion, Those are big projects that counties can undertake and are probably in a better position than the Department of Transportation to work through those. So that's something we've been working on as well.
That's great insight as well. Frank, I want to come to you to talk about our state competitiveness. And I know that you all have worked with other, agencies throughout the region. What's your assessment in terms of how South Carolina's competitiveness is impacted based on the lack of infrastructure in our rural communities?
Well, I mean, I think there are stories of success out there. So South Carolina is across the board. I mean, we talked about regulation not being as bad. It is a place people want to be. I mean, I'm thinking about Scot coming here. And I know that's there in Blythewood, but that was a major deal. Orangeburg wanted them. I mean, and there are others like that coming. And for us, when I think about the rural areas, I mean, one question I would have is, if you're a county, why would you want us? Why would you want manufactured housing? Are we going to help your tax revenue? Well, it's personal property, so it's going to depreciate, right? So, you have this issue going on, and we're looking at it going, well, I don't think a lot of times we realize we could have a development, a manufactured home development, and they all be required to be real property, where you're going to retire that title. Now suddenly, there's a tax base, there's tax revenue that can help the county. But we just look at it and go, well, it's a manufactured home, it depreciates, And look, I can't come get your house and separate it from the land, right, and haul it off. And so they see ours come in, and that's the thought is, well, I mean, it's going to But what I don't think people realize is we have that option to say, hey, you can have this development, but it's going to be real property. It's not going to be personal property. And I think when we do that, it does a couple of things. One, it helps with the tax revenue of the rural counties, which we are interested in doing. And I think that impacts our appraisals. It changes because an appraiser now has, okay, here's a house. You've got multiple houses that have sold in a similar area, which opens up financing for the constituents and the people, more traditional financing. So you start putting these things together, and now you have an asset that is going to appreciate along with the other traditional housing in the area. I think when you can put that story together and you see that as a whole, we suddenly become attractive to a county, and we can help provide workforce housing. And then I think at that point, the land use issues that we face probably get a little bit better.
So how realistic are we, or is it, to be able to put that together, to be able to create that scenario?
Yeah, I think it's very realistic. And I would say this, one thing, we're looking at this year, I saw in eastern North Carolina and western North Carolina, the growth of manufactured home communities. And so really it's now become an emphasis here. But it's that whole idea of meeting with people, and of course there are people in this room, where you're going, hey, it doesn't have to be this. It can be something that can help your tax base. And then I think about the realtors. We've never crossed that bridge between manufactured housing and real estate agents. And I'm going, well, that's who you list your house with. I list my house with one, right? So why won't we, when we do a development, that's who it's listed with, because it's real estate.
Okay. Scott, I want to come to you because you mentioned your experience in North Carolina as well when it comes to competitiveness. But you know what, before we get to that, let me ask you this question, because we were talking in the earlier session about some issues with due and just breaking through some red tape. With the state bank, what's the holdup in just reducing the threshold? Is that, am I opening up a box?
Well,
is that a whole,
yeah,
are we back on politics or something? I just,
Precisely.
okay,
Yes,
okay,
yeah.
all right. Well, I don't want to go too deep down that hole, but, just from a journalist's point of view, it's like if there's an easy answer, why don't we just fix it? But
Well, I'll give the STIB some credit, and Owen, you back me up or not. I think they are beginning to look at some of these ideas that we put forward in front of them, and the counties have as well, in relaxing some of their requirements. They're not there yet, but at least they're talking about it now, so I'll give them credit for that. But politics plays a big role, and there are a ton of big ticket items in the state that need to be dealt with. I mean, you think about the Johns Island extension of I-26 or 526 down in Charleston. a lot of other bigger projects. So
Okay.
it's just a matter of where are our priorities,
Right.
Judy?
Right.
What's our priority? Is it dealing with these big ticket items in these urban areas to relieve the congestion that they're facing, or do we put some emphasis on the rural issues and the economic development opportunities that would potentially flow from putting some effort there? So that's a decision for the STIB board and the
Okay.
Department of Transportation and the General Assembly.
Well, then that was just the heart of my question, because if it required legislative approval, then I certainly understand, the delays in terms of moving things through the State House. But if, as a state, we're putting an emphasis on really addressing some of these issues in rural communities, and something that, on the surface seems to be a simple solution. So I appreciate that context. From North Carolina, from your perspective of working regionally, what do you see as our biggest vulnerabilities when it comes to competitiveness?
Well, it's been a while since I worked in North Carolina, so but as an outside observer now, I think North Carolina probably is a little bit ahead of us in its willingness to invest in its rural communities. Just like South Carolina, North Carolina is still largely a rural state, but again, it's prioritization by that General Assembly and their bureaucracies there to address those rural areas, particularly down east, between, say, south of Raleigh, east of like Stanley County, which is Statesville, that area. I think we are, as a state, are still very competitive, obviously, when it comes to landing large manufacturing. But from our perspective as cities and towns, we'd like to see more opportunities for our rural communities to land some small economic development. Scot is a good example. I think we're going to see a lot of spinoff of secondary manufacturers coming into Fairfield County because of Scot, just like the upstate experienced when BMW arrived. So to the extent that the Department of Commerce here in our state will, I guess, not necessarily change its emphasis, but allow for more talk and recruiting to rural communities of these smaller manufacturers or other businesses, I think is something that we need to have. We need to have a small-scale economic development office at the Department of Commerce. Now, I know they have some programs there, but we, as the Municipal Association, on behalf of our 271 cities and towns, would like to see some more robust efforts from Commerce in helping to recruit smaller businesses into those
Be really
communities. Don't leave
specific.
it just to us. I mean, we're doing the best we can, but there are a lot of resources that Commerce can help, and they do. They have programs that help us, but we need more of that stuff.
Fantastic.
Right?
Before I go to Dennis for competitiveness, you wanted to weigh in quickly, Owen?
Yeah, I'm from North Carolina, and I
Okay.
actually went to NC State. And when I was at NC State, one of the biggest projects around the Raleigh-Durham area was you had Research Triangle Park, and then you also had NC State opened a Centennial campus where they brought in tech companies, partnered with the university and with local governments to send students over to work. One of the biggest companies that came out of that was Red Hat, which sold to IBM for billions of dollars. Now they probably have the biggest building in downtown Raleigh. And I've been talking to Pickens County, in particular, Roy Costner up there, who's on county council, and wondering why we have not utilized the universities, USC and Clemson, to partner with companies to bring in, have skin in the game, be able to profit off of these partnership opportunities, and produce something like a Research Triangle Park or a Centennial campus up on Clemson's campus. I mean, they are known for engineering as well. NC State has a great engineering program, USC. I just don't, I think there's something left on the table, not involving the two flagship universities and even technical colleges and other universities throughout the state. They've got a lot to sell too. They've got students in there that are going through programs that are, why wait until they graduate to get them involved in local business? Bring in local corporations, show them you've got the talent, partner with them, and keep them after these guys and gals graduate, And I've known people that have worked for SAS in Raleigh since they were in undergrad. They partner with them, and now they've been there for 20 years and they love it. So I think this is kind of out of my wheelhouse. I don't know if they need enabling legislation because the university are creatures of the state. I've done a little bit of research into that, but I think we're missing a huge opportunity by not partnering with our flagship universities to bring businesses, especially tech, which is booming throughout the nation, into South Carolina.
That's a great observation. Dennis, what are your thoughts about competitiveness, our biggest opportunities and vulnerabilities here in South Carolina?
So I agree. I think we should be linking with our universities a little bit better. As the gentleman before me stated, we probably don't do as good a job as some of our counterparts, whether that's Georgia or North Carolina at this point. And I think that we need to find a way to kind of wedge ourselves into that place so that we can have some retention and attraction. I guess attracting the students to come here, but then retaining them afterwards, right? So that we continue to grow with skilled labor force. So that's one of the things that we can improve on. One of the things we're doing good right now, I think, is, we're constantly out there beating the streets. It doesn't matter, not just domestically, but I think a lot of the new economic development that we're seeing is coming from a global format. And I can just speak to this directly because just in our area, we had a $650 billion investment a few months ago with a German company. This is right off the back of having another foreign company bring a $65 million, and another one a few years back of a Continental that came there and built 2 million square feet under roof, and now employs 1,400 people. So I think looking globally is something that we need to continue to do, and I think that's probably the path forward for all of us in the rural areas, is not to just look domestically, but look globally, get those manufacturers into our area and create those industry clusters that attract additional business around it.
Let me throw out another question, and Owen, you made me think about it because there were such great observations in terms of being able to leverage the power and knowledge, of our universities, but then also with K through 12 education when it comes to rural communities. And I'll just put this out for whoever wants to answer. We talked about this a little bit in our earlier session, but when we look at our teacher shortage, when we look at, you talked earlier about the have and the have-nots. That's very much the case with school districts, in rural districts, the have and have-nots. And through COVID, when they did not have it wasn't as easy for them to go to remote learning and all of that. So what are the challenges that we really need to overcome? What are the things we really need to invest in education in rural areas to be able to put all of these pieces together to build more economic viability for those areas?
I'm going to jump on this because
Sure.
This is a topic I get calls on this every day, but it's workforce or teacher housing, right? We can get the talent to come, and now we're paying relatively decent wages, but finding these teachers that are coming to our areas, places to live, has been a challenge. So much so that we have school districts reaching out to us, trying to partner with developers, trying to figure out some type of solution that's going to be feasible. I think we're going to get there, but right now that is the number one issue I think plaguing our school districts is attracting those teachers and knowing they're going to have a place to live.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that with education?
I'll say one thing, and this may get me some boos, but I don't think I've seen how much money we've pumped into education. I don't think it's lack of throwing money at education. I think it's responsible spending with education, and a lot of that is because you go through the General Assembly for it. I mean, if you ask the 170 members of the General Assembly how best to handle education, you get 170 different answers. And there's a split faction about, we saw it in the voucher program last year. There's not a consensus on the best way to utilize the money coming in for education. And until we get a consensus on that and actually work towards a solution, you can throw money at it all you want, but and there are certain areas of education that need more funding. Don't get me wrong. There certainly are, but there are certainly also some areas, and I'm glad no members of the General Assembly are here right now, but that we've thrown money at and we haven't seen any benefits to. So I think especially in the rural areas, it goes back to the tax base and the lack of the 6%. I wanted to hold off on Act 388 for as long as I can. But when you don't have owner-occupied people paying into the schools, and then you can't attract businesses, those school districts obviously are behind the 8 ball. So there's got to be some sort of a statewide system. I don't know. I think they're trying to move away from the Department of Education and in some manners, but until there's a consensus on how to improve our education system, I just think it's a wrong approach to just throw money at it.
Well, yeah, and that's really kind of the heart of my question, because you look at the teacher shortage, you look at the issue Dennis just pointed out. In fact, in Fairfield County right now, I mentioned it briefly earlier, they're building a teacher housing village, so to speak, where they'll rent the homes out in partnership, coming up with innovative ideas like that to recruit teachers to these areas and to be able to provide the learning is really what it is needed in those areas to be able to then translate into jobs and opportunities and all of these other things that we're discussing.
And I think the increase in the teacher salaries certainly helps, but it still does not bring them up to that $88,000 threshold where you need to be able to attain housing. Mm-hmm. So there's got to be, I'm a huge fan of state supporting the education system, because in the long run, the state as a whole is who's going to gain or lose with the education of our children.
Scott,
I mean, families are going to as well, but the state has a huge skin in the game, and so I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you.
Couple thoughts on education. My wife is a lifelong educator. She works for one of the local school districts here. My daughter is finishing up her junior year at College of Charleston. She's going to be a teacher. She's in elementary ed. She's a teacher recruit. Owen said, and he's right, the General Assembly is proposing to raise minimum starting teacher pay to $47,000. That's just from the state, on top of whatever local districts might be able to include, which are usually the haves, as we all know, so they can be more competitive. How do we compete in the rural areas? Pick up on what Dennis said with regard to workforce housing, and we've used the word a couple times already, stigma, but people hear workforce or affordable housing. There's a stigma attached to that, a lot of NIMBYism that comes with that, which is unfounded, unwarranted. So I think we need to help all of our neighbors overcome some of these fears of what workforce housing really means. It's teacher housing, it's nurses housing, police, fire, electric linemen, you name it. We have been working on a couple of things. In fact, we worked with Habitat for Humanity in South Carolina last year on a change in state law to allow cities and towns and counties to use state and local accommodations taxes for the development of workforce housing, to either do some of that work on their own or to partner with you all out there. We are working on a bill right now that is dealing with nonprofits and their partnerships with developers to create workforce housing and affordable housing. So not only is it important for education, but in these rural areas, I think we need to be able to take advantage of these tools that we're working on. And then I don't know how to overcome the NIMBYism problem. Y'all can help us with that. Cities and towns are facing that a lot, as all of the, and not just with workforce housing. If y'all are proposing to build something in a growing area right now, what you're hearing is the folks that are already here who came from off say, we're already here, we don't want anybody else. That's a problem. And not only does it apply to market rate housing, but certainly even more so to workforce housing. So I would hope that all of you in this room could help us as cities and towns and counties kind of beat that problem back.
Absolutely. I'm going to open it up for questions in just a moment. Just a reminder, we'll have you raise your hand, and one of our wonderful staff members will bring you a microphone. But I don't want to lose track of the question. We talked a little bit earlier, Frank, about stigma. So I wanted to come back to you on that to ask, do you think we are making progress in overcoming that stigma? Where are the gaps? Where do they still exist? And how much work do we still have to do?
Yeah, we're definitely making progress overcoming the stigma. I'm just thinking about some infill housing we did in Atlanta just recently, and Winston-Salem now is partnered with us on some infill housing, and a lot of it is aesthetics. You know, it's the same house. It's a HUD code home, and it just looks different. And so, you know, those are things we can overcome. And you always have to bear in mind when you're overcoming something, what's the cost? Because you don't want to just suddenly price yourself out of the attainable housing market. But we've made tons of progress on it. And so I think where we are now is we need more opportunity. I'm looking at, you know, I'm just thinking about contractors. You were talking about how Scot's going to impact so many other things. You know, our industry impacts electricians, HVAC. I was talking to a young man this morning. He wants to get into HVAC because of what it pays. You've got, our houses have to be set, you know, and we just purchased our almost our third company, private company we're purchasing, putting under our House Smart brand. So now when you see somebody setting a house, they have a hard hat on, they're meeting OSHA guidelines. So we've had to change, we've certainly changed the standard for us, and that's across the board with MHIC. They've done an amazing job with it. And so I think that has really impacted that. And I got to say one thing about teachers, sorry.
Sure, please do.
Because, you know, I have a history of teachers in my family, 30 years, all this. I did it for 1 year, okay? So teaching, like being a pastor, is a calling, you know, but at the same time, if you don't get paid, you know, it's tough to maintain that calling, right? So we've been talking a lot about robust pay. And when you think about robust pay, one way I know that somebody appreciates me when I work for them, guess what? They pay me.
Pay you, yeah.
And I feel more appreciated the more they pay me. So, you know, there is part of that for, you know, with the education side. And I'm not a politician, so I can't. But that plays a significant role. And my wife was a nurse, you know. My wife started nursing. That was 13 years ago. She started at 20 an hour. We thought we were rich, you know. And now I'm looking going, man, how it's changed, and it should change, you know, for those people.
Frank,
Yes.
if my daughter doesn't get paid next year, guess where she's going to be living?
Am I going to be selling? Hey, give me your name. Her number.
We went from an empty nest to back to a full house. Remember when multiple generations used to live with each other? That's what we're getting back to.
Well, and there's so many other complications because of the things, you know, you're talking about. I can't remember what the topic was we were discussing, but just in terms of legislation that gets passed that puts a lot of mandates in place, but then if you don't have the support system in place to really implement those mandates, and teachers are finding out they can get paid a lot more with a lot less stress and doing things other places where they have more support to be able to accomplish what they need to do. Questions from the audience? Sir, we'll come and then we'll go to the back. Just make sure you.
I'm going to be that data nerd again.
Okay, let's do it. Introduce yourself to our new panel, please.
Curtis Askew. I run data industry consulting, so I think like a consultant all the time. You gentlemen have all used the term rural, but how are you defining rural? There are multiple ways to do it. The state does it, the federal government does it. I work down in the Charleston area. They have a urban growth boundary that changes. Can you talk a little bit about how that then intersects with the concepts and strategies that you've already spoken about?
Like some other things that you've heard courts refer to, in my view, rural. You know it when you see it.
I knew you were going to
Too predictable. I mean, I grew up rural in northern Greenville County in the dark corner.
Thank you.
I worked in North Carolina in a rural town in a rural county, and worked in southern Spartanburg County, which was rural, but is no longer, I would consider, to be rural because of the explosive growth that is taking place in parts of southern Spartanburg County. I think your question points to a problem in defining rural. Whose definition do we use? And there are multiple definitions of rural and affordable and whatever you want to that throughout state law anyway. I think your question is a good one and points out the problem with the consistency in how we describe things. But really, depending on what the topic is, be it transportation, water, sewer, broadband, you name it, schools, they all have different definitions of rural from the federal level on down to the local level.
Did anyone else want to weigh in on that? I mean, I think that's pretty encompassing.
At first, Mark Mitchell, the Builders Association of South Carolina, I want to thank each of you for being up here. I had a couple quick comments. I think I look at the same thing. I agree with you. I'm a generational home too. I have 4 kids, and I think 3 of them are back with me. The 4th one probably will be back with me here fairly soon, because what we've talked about. But I mean, I kind of look at, our members, I agree with them in education. Our members want to build where the good schools. That's where people want to live. And I think we're going to discuss that when we start talking about property tax reform in a second. I think the other issues I've seen across the state are, one, I mean, we see the NIMBYism as you talk about. I think the biggest issue we have is that congestion. And I think part of the answer is when we look at the CDCs you're talking about, I don't think we have anywhere in the state that actually has a budget for congestion relief, right? And I think that's what we need to go back to the CPCs. It's more than just paving new roads. There's other options that go along with it, so I would throw that out there in the case there's a comment. The other one is on the sewer that you brought up, Scott, before too. We're seeing the use of more septic tanks. I know we have a bill at the State House now to help out with that, but we're also seeing more cities and counties now basically outlaw septic tanks. We have one up in the upstate that went from a ½ acre to 1.5 acre lots, which now costs, it adds about $80,000 now to the price of that new lot. And it takes away from when we talk about the teachers, but I appreciate any comments on those.
Well, and Mark, of course, you and I know that was in reaction to, again, this NIMBYism. We're here already. We don't want anybody else to come. And so that's why that upstate county did that. As cities and towns, we're more than happy to try and expand our water and sewer services out and annex more folks into the city who want to use those. But annexation is a 4-letter word, and so we have to overcome some of those obstacles as well. I don't propose to have any of the answers. As we pointed out, and you asked earlier, Judi, it's incremental and around the edges.
Right.
We don't have, as a state, in my opinion anyway, we don't have an appetite to take on these big challenges in a meaningful way, but incremental progress is progress nonetheless.
Have to keep working at it. Did you want to add in, Frank?
I think you did hit on an issue that I know we face. We're out in the county, and so if you're going to buy a home from us, we're going to build a house. We're going to have a perk test done, and I'm an individual homeowner. I'm looking for affordable, attainable housing. Well, now I'm not saying there's a fault to DHEC. I think we've been overrun. You're right. Everybody's coming. You've got all these permits, but okay, you can wait 16 weeks, or you can pay an engineer $1,600 to come out and perk your land. Well, I might not have $1,600 because I paid the $1,600 and they come back and tell me it's a $30,000 engineered septic system. Well, that pretty much shot it right there. I'm done. So it's become, for us and for really the people that we're serving in the counties, I mean, it's become a major issue. And I don't know the solution to it. I know there were some things floating around. I know we have incredible septic contractors throughout the state, but it definitely impacts affordable and attainable housing when you're talking about, and then counties going, you can't have, this portion of the state or whatever, you're not going to put a septic tank in, or they're going to change the lot size. All of that impacts it. All of that impacts the housing. And then if we're talking about doing a development, and I don't have any infrastructure, now I've got cost of development, going out and trying to make sure, will these perk? How much are they going to be? It can put a real damper on that.
Absolutely. Question up here, Todd, in the microphone.
Just a quick comment. We mentioned the HEROES program earlier, and that's been brought up right now. And I gave out a statistic earlier The first week, we gave out 12.4 million. Our total budget is roughly 40 million. So we will run out of funds in about 3.5 weeks for that program, which $40 million in the grand scheme of things is not a drop in the bucket for the amount of demand that we have for that program. And people are waiting, as you can imagine, in line, and it's a well-publicized program, and it'll break your heart when you continue to get hundreds of applications of people that would typically qualify, and the $40 million is gone. So it's about a 3.5 week process, just to give you, ladies and gentlemen, some additional information on the HEROES program. It's not everybody that applies. When the money's gone, the money's gone. That's all I want to say.
Great insight. We appreciate that very much. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, sir. We can get the microphone to the middle. If you'd be so kind as to introduce yourself to the panel. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Dale Lackey. I'm from Spartanburg, and I just got kind of a question when I asked Frank. We talk about workforce housing, and I know when we look at various subdivisions throughout the state, it's just, you're looking at what our workforce make versus what they have to pay for housing. And I know that manufactured housing probably is a very good way to go, but I don't know that a lot of us really understand what it is that makes a house or what an affordable workforce housing looks like. So Frank, could you describe this kind of what it would look, what the exterior, what the elevations, what the actual house
You
would look
probably
like?
do a better job than me. He's been doing this a long time.
Has he?
So,
All
yeah.
right, Dale.
Interesting, it could look a lot of ways. I was talking to someone up in Rock Hill, which is my hometown, and he is looking more at something that would be close to a tiny home. It's not a tiny home, but it's a HUD code home, right? 1976, they change it, and it goes to HUD. So it's a HUD code home, and it's a small one. I was at the Berkshire Hathaway show. We had a 14 by 60, small, single section home, had a garage with it, had a place out back. I mean, somebody was describing, you were describing the house, a much smaller house. I grew up in the same type of house. And when you think about, you could have a house, maybe all of our bedrooms are on the back side, have a front living room area, maybe dining kitchen area together. It's a porch on the front. That is, Dale, that is kind of what I see when I start thinking about it and the different, and I think, our houses can look a lot of different ways. You go by some of our offices now and they're pit set. You go to Atlanta and you look at the cross mod they put down there, and, it's a low profile. So there's a lot of different ways, and again, when you're doing these things, you're bearing in mind the cost. Who's your audience, right? That determines, to me, because just take my kids. With my kids, I'm thinking, I want them to have a nice house. So maybe I'm going to subsidize some of the house, but they don't need that, right? Sometimes I put them to a standard, and we all do. And then they are used to growing up in a house that's nice. So then but allowing us to go, hey, this price point is where our county is at, or where our city is at. It's $250,000. Well, in Rock Hill, I can't find anything. $250,000, I can't find anything. And if I do, I'm going to end up paying $290,000.
Yeah, Big Bubby would move into a manufactured house if he could find a piece of property to put it on that he could afford as a package. That's the other problem is finding that lot to put it on.
To put it on.
Yeah.
We have just a few minutes left. If we have one more question from the audience, we'll work that in, and we'll have basically a closing statement from our panelists, about 30 seconds on our topic. It's been a great panel discussion. Any final question from the audience? Well, gentlemen, we'll close it out by kind of a broad question, the way that we started, but in terms of these discussions being really a starting point, right? There's so much, and it's such a complex issue with so many layers. What would be your challenge, your charge in terms of what we can do, what we should be doing collectively as a society, or even individually, where we should be investing our focus in order to help support our rural community infrastructure needs. And Dennis, I'll start with you.
So I think that's, can you hear me?
Back
Yeah.
in now.
All right. So I think for me, that's a pretty easy understanding there, right? Because we have to invest in the infrastructure. It is a smart investment. And not to mimic what we hear from Rural Infrastructure Authority and their leadership saying, but infrastructure, it draws everything from residential development to economic development, which ultimately creates workforce development. If you don't have the infrastructure in place now, you need to, because that's the only way we're going to grow, the only way we're going to keep ourselves competitive. And once again, just to say it one more time, it is simple and clear message: invest in infrastructure, period.
Thank you very much. Frank, what would you add to that and about how we make those investments?
Yeah, and I would echo that. I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I think also for all of us to see our role, I'm off-site housing. We have on-site home builders. We have multifamily home builders. And I'm thinking, we have realtors, and it's got to be a coming together. Of course, that includes the counties and the cities. There's got to be some form of, okay, we're not competitors. Are we competitors? Maybe we are, but that's secondary to the people of South Carolina that we've got to serve. And so I think all of us coming together on that, us having the opportunity to meet with county officials and leaders, city leaders, to say, here's an option, So I think that's a responsibility that Manufactured Housing Institute has taken on.
Thank you, Frank. Owen, what do we need to do to support our infrastructure needs in rural communities?
I think he's spot on. I mean, get involved. Go to your county council meetings. Go to your city council meetings. I tell, I lobby on behalf of all 46 counties. I don't represent one county. If I did, I would have probably been fired for their actions a long time ago. I can't sit here and defend everything every county does. But I will tell you, when I go up to the General Assembly and ask for something on behalf of counties, they want to know if their county has reached out to them. And I look at it the same way you guys. Unless they hear it from you, it doesn't matter. So get involved on the city level, the local level, even at the state level. That's really the way you see change. And it's a slow process, as Judi mentioned earlier. Getting anything through the General Assembly is very difficult. But I'm a firm proponent that the government closest to the people is the best. And so that's why I, as representing county councils throughout the state, I urge you to go to county councils meetings, go to city council meetings, and explain to them what you need. Because if they don't hear it from you, they have no incentive to do it.
Great insight, Owen. Thank you very much. Final chart, Scott?
Yeah, well said. I will make sure everybody understands that the General Assembly pushed out over $1.3 billion in American Rescue Plan funds last year, year before last. Those funds are for water and sewer projects all over the state. Great work that's going to be going on. Those projects have to be completed by the end of 2026. They have to be allocated, appropriated by the local jurisdiction by the end of this year, and then the funds spent. Pay attention to what is going on in your communities, in the communities where you want to do work with regard to the deployment of those funds. It is going to work on a lot of deferred maintenance that Owen mentioned earlier, but it's also going to bring a number of efficiencies and consolidations of inefficient water and sewer systems across the state. So to the extent that you can take advantage of that in your business, I would encourage you to do that. And the way to do that is just what Owen said, is talk to your city council members, county council members, find out what those projects are doing and how you as an industry can benefit the entire community and your industry in taking advantage of that money that's being put in the ground.
We appreciate that very much. I want to take a moment to be sure to thank our generous sponsors for today: Lennar, Mungo Homes, Clayton Homes, Connolly Builders Incorporated as well. I also want to thank our panelists for their time. We appreciate your time and expertise. Frank Hamrick, Dennis Cyphers, Owen McBride, and Scot Slatton. Let's give them all a big round of applause. Thank you so much. And I have learned as a moderator a long time ago, you do not stand between an audience and lunch. So if you want to keep in touch with them or have questions for them, make sure that you get their contact information before they head out this afternoon, and we'll get directions for lunch momentarily. But gentlemen, thank you once again. It was very insightful. We appreciate it.